Good morning, Bitcoins. This is MadBitcoins live. We're joined by Peter Todd, Bitcoin core contributor. Peter, thank you so much for being on the show.
Thank you for having me on.
This is our second day of Bitcoin scaling discussions. The idea being that I really felt like Bitcoin was going over Niagara Falls, and I wanted to say, hold on, let's try to talk about this a little bit. Yesterday, I had Roger Ver on. I kind of gave Roger the floor. I let him get all of his opinions out there, and now we have a really nice document, a really nice video that we can timestamp, and we can go back and discuss with all of Roger's opinions in there. So in that mode of discussion, we're going to go on today. But first, we have to stop and we have to apologize. I used the wrong term to describe the Bitcoin core team. I called them the Blockstream core team. I was told later this is a major slur, and I'd like to apologize for this slur. I meant no disrespect to the Bitcoin core team, and I just wanted to apologize. So hopefully we can move on with that. My goal is simply to reach out to Twitter in 140 characters, tag a company, tag people to try to get some attention so we could get someone to talk to us who would respond to the things that Roger said. And it worked out because Peter Todd is here to respond to us. So hopefully everyone's okay and we can move on past the semantic difficulties straight into the issues. If you're watching at home, there's about 50 of you. If you could give us a like and a share, that'd be great so that more people could join in. I'm going to check the chat later for more questions, so be sure to have those. Maybe write them down in a separate file. You could copy and paste them over. But if we have time, we'll go to audience questions. If not, leave them in the comments after and we can answer them in a future video. So we're going to start with the most difficult questions first. Roger was pretty much describing a clear path to a Bitcoin fork and a clear path to what he saw as an inevitable Bitcoin unlimited victory. One of the main things that Roger described is that the Bitcoin difficulty only updates every 2 weeks. So if Roger were to take, say, 30, 50, 70% of the miners out of Bitcoin, the difficulty would be increasingly impossible high for those next 2 weeks. And Bitcoin core, for lack of a better name, would be incredibly difficult to mine. Peter, is this true? Does Bitcoin core have a plan for this? What's going to happen?
Roger's really conflating two issues, actually. First of all, if miners go drop off, after all, mining's kind of like a lottery, right? It's sort of like we have these magical machines that generate lotto tickets, and we scratch and sniff them off. And if you win your winning ticket, you get a block. Oversimplifying a little, but that's basically how the stats of it work. And when you, of course, take off, like say, 75% of the machines on the network, obviously less blocks are going to be produced. And since there's less blocks being produced, blocks are going to take longer on average to be found. So rather than having an effective block interval of, say, 10 minutes, you might have an effective block interval of, say, 40 minutes. But from the point of view of people trying to go hold Bitcoin, does that actually matter? It kind of sucks. It's an inconvenience, but this isn't a life or death thing.
And this would be a 2 week period, right? After 2 weeks?
Longer than that.
Longer than that? Okay.
Remember, it's 2 weeks worth of blocks, but the 2 weeks is in number of blocks. So since blocks are taking longer to go find, multiply that 2 weeks by however much longer they are to go find. So it will take quite a while to go return to normal. But once it does return to normal, everything's back to normal. Now, the interesting thing is, from the point of view of a miner, though, you're going to earn the same amount of revenue because the difficulty doesn't change. The problem is not the difficulty going up, rather it's because the difficulty doesn't go down. So, difficulty stays unchanged, and miners will earn the same amount of, Bitcoins per unit, electricity or whatever, as they were before. And then when the difficulty adjusts, suddenly they're earning way more Bitcoins than before. Now, what are those Bitcoins worth?
It sounds much worse than it is what you're saying, that the miners would continue to make the same amount of money per mining time, and that it would just take
Bitcoin.
Same amount of Bitcoin.
Yeah.
But there's the rub.
Potentially more if fees go up. And it's kind of hard to predict. If you had a lot of the economic activity, or really I should say the transaction generating activity, stay on the Bitcoin chain, fees will naturally go up because there's a lot more competition for the same, or I should say there's potentially, the same amount of competition for much less block space for that temporary period. So it could even be, if Roger is incorrect and say the economic majority is staying on his side, mining could actually become more profitable on Bitcoin than Bitcoin Unlimited.
So in addition to
Mining
the
all less.
hashing power moving around, we also have the people that use Bitcoin moving around. And if the people that
Exactly.
use
Yeah.
Bitcoin stay with Core, there'll be lots of fees. The miners will make that. They'll make the block reward, and the difficulty will adjust eventually.
Well, I mean, and even that's complex because after all, people using Bitcoin, some people are holding, some people are doing transactions, and if you're just holding, you may not be affected at all, and you may not be contributing many transactions. Similarly, if people are doing a lot of transactions who stay on Bitcoin, then those people will, of course, want to keep doing their transactions. Equally, all this mess of one coin suddenly turning into two coins and all this trading activity, that could end up being more transactions in total on the whole system, or at least more demand. So, I mean, do I really want to go predict things? No. All I can predict is eventually difficulty readjusts. And let's face it, 40-minute block control, it sure is inconvenient, but it is not a life or death thing.
And we do have banks that take several days to do clearing. We have mortgages that take 30 days to clear. The existing financial system is full of slowdowns. And it might not be convenient if you're going to try to buy coffee or leaving a store after paying in Bitcoin. But for most other transactions, it would still be a useful network, right?
Yeah. I mean, as an example, like if I were Satoshi today designing Bitcoin for the first time around, I may very well have a block control of an hour because, we can expect that it's mostly going to be layer 2 things built on top of Bitcoin where people actually do the transactions. And these systems are more secure the longer you give between blocks. There's diminishing returns. I mean, if we made it 1 week, that's just getting ridiculous. But based on what we know, an hour could be a reasonable decision. And long story short, that's not gonna be the thing that actually kills Bitcoin. I mean, you're gonna have to actively attack it.
Now, I think this fits a little into one thing that Roger kept saying, and he kept repeating over and over again. He said yesterday that high fees and full blocks are destroying Bitcoin, and that's one part. And he also said that the core developers are advocating for high fees and full blocks. How would you respond to those two statements?
Well, I mean, advocating is a bit of a strong word. Rather, high fees and full blocks is just a function of how Bitcoin works. Unfortunately, the reality of these systems is you have to pay miners somehow. And, given that Bitcoin, we can't just increase the block size indefinitely, you're going to end up, having a lot of competition if Bitcoin's successful. And on top of that, in the long run, the inflation reward goes down. And you have to replace that with something. Currently, the only way that we know of to replace it is with transaction fees. And transaction fees aren't going to go and, be at all reasonably high unless you have competition for the system. Keep in mind, while a lot of these use cases aren't all that mature, when you go have a ledger that you can go right to without permission, very good security properties, that's going to get used for a lot of things, not necessarily even just Bitcoin. So the demand for that kind of use is enormous. I mean, Jeff Garzik likes to use the term fidelity effect for people getting turned away from Bitcoin. But what he's actually referring to is apparently some test thing in Fidelity Labs, from the fintech industry, who wanted to go record, I think it was stocks or something on the blockchain. And they were going to do hundreds of thousands of Bitcoin transactions, because every stock would be associated with, one transaction output or something like that. You have to check the details, but essentially that alone was an enormous demand. And I personally, in my consulting business, I've seen tons of people go propose all kinds of things for Bitcoin. Often things that can pay very high transaction fees because they're associated with very high value transactions. And that demand, I mean, how do you go put a lid on that,
And this would be similar to something like Factom storing their keys in the blockchain, or Counterparty storing their keys in the blockchain, alternative uses rather than just a currency or a store of value.
Exactly. And equally, when you are talking about a currency, I mean, once you get the ability to package up multiple transactions into one, and a good example is, for instance, remittance applications, where frequently what we're seeing is both ends of the the remittance process are done not in Bitcoin. but it's in the middle where Bitcoin is replacing the conventional financial infrastructure that we're seeing the use of Bitcoin. But, if you're remitting 100 payments at once, that's how you're balancing your books. Reality is you can go afford a $10 transaction fee. Do I think it's a good thing that we're forced into an architecture like that? Heck no. But I mean, that's, what we have to go deal with. And those very high value use cases are going to push out low value use cases until we find better ways to scale.
Now, speaking of Factom, I saw a great article that was on your Twitter today. I'm going to go ahead and screen share. It was by Brian Deary. And what Brian said, he was talking about Factom and SegWit. And unbeknownst to most of us, Factom has had SegWit since the beginning due to a compromise. And I'm just going to go and read from Brian's article right here where he talks about the philosophy. He says that the first philosophy was to have the entire transaction, signature and all, be included as part of the block hash. This would lock the transaction down for all time, but it would cause some heartache on the P2P network. If two malleated transactions existed on the network at the same time, the P2P network would have to sort it out before proceeding. This is the same as any other double spend, though. He also talks, the second part, he says, the second philosophy was to leave the signature out of the block hash entirely. Malleability would not be a problem since every node could safely have different malleations, but still create the same block hash. Later, when these blocks are old enough, their signatures could be deleted, and just the balance changes retained. The ledger balance updates could still be proven to be complete because their hashes would still match. And he goes on to talk about the different problems of malleability in a multi-sig. If two people sign it, we can't tell who confirms the transaction. Someone could insert a signature later. Then there's two signatures and we can't prove which one's valid. How does this build into SegWit? How does this link into what we've all been talking about?
Well, I mean, I think the thing to say about that is they had the same problem that Bitcoin has, and they end up coming up with the same solution. I mean, it's not like SegWit was built on Factom or vice versa. As far as I can tell, was two completely independent inventions. And in both cases, the people working on it, with the same problem, they came up with the same solution, and they came up with the right one. In fact, funny enough, me personally, prior to SegWit, I had a similar situation in something called proof chains that I was working on, and I made the wrong decision. I decided to go with what Bitcoin was doing, and sure enough, well, I got asked to go, do some more work on proof chains, and one of the first things I'm going to end up doing, is ripping out my old Bitcoin-like transaction style and replace it with something like SegWit. It's just the right way to go do this stuff.
And just to recap what we talked about yesterday, SegWit is basically separate signatures. So you don't store the signatures in the block. You get about 1.5 meg increase for this. And it's been testing on the network for about a year. So I'm going to go back to some questions here. Why did SegWit take so long?
Well, I mean, we have high code review standards. As an example, in my blog, I wrote, I think it's about a dozen pages or so, very careful line-by-line review of the consensus critical code of SegWit. That's just one of many different code reviews that people did. And, the idea is simple, but just because it's simple doesn't mean you want to be absolutely sure it works. There's also a lot of argument over exactly how you do various things. And, that's just part of the process, because often if you go with your first exact way of doing something, you go find out there's something better later. So you build in time into the schedule to let people argue about that. If you look at my blog post, I personally have some criticisms of the low-level details of exactly how things are hashed and so on. And I personally actually dropped those criticisms because I figured, this is good enough. Get it out the door and make sure it's dead simple.
And this is people's money, so there's a reason to go slow and steady with it and to be careful with the code. I know people have made mistakes in code and people lose documents or you lose a server or something, but this is actually money, right? So
yeah. Well, I mean, after all, when Bitcoin goes down, on the mining reward alone, you're looking at right now like 12.5 Bitcoins times $1,000. So that's like $12,000 every 10 minutes that people are losing just on mining rewards. I mean, needless to say, we're not going to go take things lightly there.
Now, speaking of not taking things lightly, and this is more of a general core question, so I appreciate you answering it, even though I know you don't represent core directly, but was there an attempt to talk to Roger and the miners? I know there was these scaling conferences we pretty much have three groups. We have the techs, the users, the miners. Was there any attempt like to get these groups together? What were your thoughts on these attempts?
I mean, there are quite a few attempts. You look at the scalability conferences, in particular the one held in the Bitcoin scaling held in Hong Kong. That was attended by a lot of miners. Then you also go have the rather ill-fated, Bitcoin Roundtable Consensus, or Hong Kong Consensus, as it's often called, where we tried to go and come up with a proposal that other people would accept, and on one side, the very idea of doing that was thoroughly rejected, and people refused to go and be a part of it. And on the other side, we had the miners not really upholding the spirit of it. In particular, F2 Pool immediately went and mined a Bitcoin Classic block. Not long after that was, that agreement was signed. So, when you kind of do that, given that a big purpose of the agreement from their point of view was, let's go reduce the drama for a bit and give people time to go work in peace. When you try to amp up the drama again, with what's really a troll, you're not going to get other developers on board. Luke Jr. in particular, actually did code for a hard fork proposal, but we never really got much feedback from it from any of the miners, so nothing really went forward there.
So the basic idea of the Hong Kong agreement was to do a 2 megabyte block raise and then to include SegWit. Was it going to be a soft fork both times, or was it hard fork, soft fork?
That's actually a common misconception.
Okay.
So what SegWit does is it increases the maximum block size to 4 megabytes. But to maintain backwards compatibility, all but 1 megabyte of that 4 is only used for signature data. So what was proposed in Hong Kong was that we would go take that 1 megabyte, do a hard fork to make it 2 megabytes, and then the rationale for that being that with Schnorr signatures, you can go combine multiple signatures into one, and then that would kind of balance the other side. So even though we reduced the signature space, we'd still get the same number of transactions per second, or or more. I shouldn't quote exact numbers there, but essentially we thought it'd be, say, roughly double the number of transactions per second once fully deployed as currently exists. The nice thing about that is, since it's not an overall maximum block size increase, many types of attacks wouldn't be applicable. Because the biggest attack you can have as a miner is to make sure your blocks propagate slowly. And there's a couple ways to do it, but one of the simplest ones is just make them bigger.
Now, Roger and I discussed this yesterday, and he said that it was okay for the miners to be mining empty blocks, that it was a necessary slowdown in the system, and they had the choice of not mining a block or mining an empty block. How do you see this, the empty blocks discussion?
My thinking on a lot of these issues in general is we should accept that people do what's rational for them. And in certain cases, mining an empty block is actually the rational thing to go do. And essentially the reason is, if you know that someone else has produced a block, but you haven't actually fully verified it, given that it's very likely to be correct, it makes sense for you as a miner to then mine an empty block on top of that. And since it's empty, it's valid, right? Because it doesn't spend any transaction outputs that the previous block could have spent. So that optimization, it's not good for light clients. It does reduce the security of Bitcoin in many ways, but from the point of view of miner, absolutely they would go do it. And this is why, for instance, Matt Crowlow has done a tremendous amount of work on optimizing block propagation, to the point where if you're using his tech as well as the compact blocks in Bitcoin Core, the difference between mining empty blocks and not is very small, because so much of the block data is pre-propagated. Now, I'd caution you though, which is that only works if miners cooperate with each other. If they don't cooperate, they'll mine blocks that's already been propagated, and it's in their advantage to do this in many cases. Because after all, if I'm a miner and you're a miner, if I'm the one more likely to find the next block, for instance, if I have, say, majority of hashing power, me and my 5 other buddies with fast internet connections, I don't want you to get my block anytime soon. The longer it takes you to get it, the longer you're sitting there twiddling your thumbs, wasting hashing power, doing nothing. and that's good for me. It means I'm out competing you. And as it turns out, the threshold for this is actually 30%, because when I find a block, I'm 1 block ahead. And for you to go win, you have to find 2 blocks in a row. And remember, when I say 30%, I mean myself and whoever else I can quickly get my blocks to. So, it's a pretty rough threshold there.
Now let's move on to another problem and solution with SegWit is transaction malleability. Now, I repeated this yesterday and Roger disagreed with me, but what I've heard about the Mt. Gox problem is that the Mt. Gox system kept sending out transactions, but they couldn't confirm them. So the system just kept sending the transactions, and this was an alleged transaction malleability bug. And part of what SegWit does, by my understanding, is that it solves this so that we'll know which transaction is which. Is this a good basic understanding of the solution?
I mean, you're technically correct. It definitely does solve that problem. But, I mean, in Mt. Gox's particular case, the obvious thing to do was to go see what transaction outputs were spent, and what people had actually been paid. And for their particular use case, if that really was a problem, they're being pretty negligent. They just did not write good software there. Now, where transaction malleability really, is a real showstopper, though, is more advanced protocols that depend on one transaction being able to be mined after another transaction. Anytime you need to have 2 transactions that are unconfirmed to be able to reliably get them mined, that's where SegWit really shines. Now, certainly nice for wallets to be able to rely on transaction IDs. It makes the code a lot simpler, but it's just one of those things where Mt. Gox should have done things right. And yes, the implementation would be more complex without SegWit, but it's just a big mistake they made ultimately.
All right, I think this leads well into miner incentives. Some people have said that when the fees were high and the price was high, the miners had no incentive to include SegWit. Also, people are worried that on the other side of SegWit is the layer 2 technologies, things like the Lightning Network, kind of a game of telephone where we'd all send the Bitcoin around and we'd only settle to the Bitcoin network every once in a while rather than every transaction. Is there room in the future for the miners? Will they still make money under Lightning? And did they block SegWit because they were making too much money?
Well, interesting theory with this is, first and foremost, they block SegWit because it is a block size increase. Now, is that actually true? It's hard to know. But, if you were really that concerned about keeping fees up, SegWit's a big problem for you because it is, block size increase. And one of the sort of conspiracy theories of this is by making sure that no one gets their way, they keep the block size low for as long as possible. Do I believe that? I don't really know. But, that's certainly plausible. And then as for trying to go block layer 2 protocols, I think you can certainly temporarily go do this. If miners wanted to do this, blocking SegWit definitely delays things. But the reality is, these protocols can be built without SegWit as well. It's not as nice. It's hard to go do them in a fully peer-to-peer way, but you certainly can still implement that. And you've been able to ever since my check lock time verify opcode was activated, which was, I think now, what, 2 or 2.5 years ago or something. So, this has been possible for a while. But, I think it is interesting to see, for instance, Jihan tweeting a link to that article that very clearly describes how miners should go block SegWit. And if I remember correctly, they made the analogy to OPEC, where, with miners being OPEC, by allowing these technologies to exist, they screw over their future. And, it's kind of an interesting situation because from the user's point of view, they're much better off if SegWit activates. From a small miner's point of view, they're probably better off in that they can't, they just cannot compete on large block sizes anyway. But from a large pool's point of view, they may very well make the gamble that they can still make money. They'll get more money from transaction fees, and users won't leave Bitcoin due to it being centralized. And, I'm not going to say likes of Jihan are dumb. I think they're actually being quite smart here, and they recognize what the incentives are. And unfortunately, the incentives are just incompatible with what the users are interested in, what's good for users there. I mean, it's interesting, like Bitcoin Unlimited, if it activated, would we ever see a malleability fix? Maybe not. Bitcoin Classic has FluxTrans, which aims to have this, but maybe what we'd see is, FluxTrans never get activated either for this case.
It is very easy for them to say we'll activate something after the fork and then never activate it. We have no way of really tying them down to anything like that. I think this builds to a question that we had. Let's see, I've just lost it. The guy was asking, oh yes, we were talking about the block size. So if the blocks are too big, it was my understanding that they would cause a problem with the Great Firewall of China, that there'd be a latency issue and perhaps miners in China would be disadvantaged. This might break up Bitcoin mining centralization, spread it across the world, but it would be unfair to them. And we currently have a lot of mining power, electricity there. They build the miners there. Roger's solution was something he called extra thin and compact blocks. Is this an acceptable solution? Is the Great Firewall still a problem?
Well, actually, the problem is the other way around, because currently in China, they have they're well over that 30% threshold I spoke about earlier. And within China, if I'm in one province in China and you're in another province, the connection between us is very fast. China internally has a modern high-speed internet. So since you're over that threshold, having slow propagation to the rest of the world is actually an advantage to China, not a disadvantage. And equally, I mean, with things like compact blocks and X-thin, if you choose to cooperate with other miners, the slow propagation of data doesn't actually affect you all that much, because most of that data is already pre-propagated. So the whole story there is actually pretty much the reverse of what a lot of people naively thought.
That's interesting to think about, that yes, you'd actually be better off inside of your network because the rest of the miners are there with you. It's like a Quake playing analogy. If you're playing Quake in that network, you'd be much better off. And then your outside people trying to compete would have an incredibly latency time.
Yeah. Well, and actually that's a remarkably good analogy. It's probably one of the better analogies I've heard of that. I mean, that's exactly the case. If the majority of people in a Quake Deathmatch are inside China, well, they're the ones who are going to get all the scores because they outnumber you.
That clan rules. I got to get on that team. Let's see. We got another question from the audience. Loki Sullivan asks, he says, why doesn't Core increase the block size? And can you answer this without attacking BU or saying that it's not needed? Because in his opinion, it's needed.
Well, I mean, Core did go compromise, and they proposed a block size increase in the form of SegWit. I mean, that's your simplest answer there. And there are certainly people within Bitcoin Core who were opposed to increasing the block size at all, including via SegWit. But I can kind of say internally among the discussions in developers, Gregor Maxwell, in his original scaling proposals, made a good argument that SegWit contained enough mitigations to the block size increase that was probably acceptable to do as a one-time thing. Whether or not you're going to get future block size increases is, it's really a matter for the whole community to go decide. But SegWit itself is certainly a proposal for a block size increase.
Now, the basic idea that I've heard is if we soft fork to SegWit, they could do a block size increase later without a hard fork. Is that true?
That's not true.
Okay.
Because essentially the way that SegWit is a block size increase is that it takes advantage of the fact that old nodes don't see the signature data. But for it to not be a block size increase, you actually have to add extra code, which is to reduce reduce the limit for non-signature data by the amount of signature data. So the total block size stays under 1 megabyte. By not doing that, SegWit's naturally a block size increase. But if you do that, remember, that's an additional rule. Taking away a rule is a hard fork, because you're breaking the rules from the perspective of old Bitcoin nodes, and the blocks you're creating are no longer backwards compatible. So if we did SegWit without a block size increase, to add a block size increase to it would be a hard fork.
So if this is necessary, Core's path could be Core to SegWit to another hard fork to a block size, and there'd be 2 Bitcoins there, potentially another Bitcoin with unlimited, 3 total Bitcoins.
To be clear, the order there
be,
is Core, soft fork SegWit, then a hard fork. You know, again, SegWit's not a hard fork.
Right.
But yeah, you know, I mean, and given that the increase that SegWit does is, you know, a bump, it's not an unlimited size increase, the technical risk of it seems to be acceptable, and people are willing to go do that right away. Now, interestingly, from a miner's point of view, I mean, if this, you know, sort of pseudo conspiracy theory was correct, then they may very well accept SegWit if it didn't have a block size increase. But, you know, the point there being, if they wanted to, they could just go and collude with each other to go keep their block size limit low. You know, whether or not it's politically possible is another matter, but they certainly could do that.
All right, we've got another question from the audience. The audience says, can you talk more about the potential change in proof of work if the minority chain gets attacked, particularly the Bram-Cohen BitTorrent proposal?
Yeah, you know, I gotta admit, I haven't had a chance to go and read his proposal, you know, his actual proposal. But in general, having more than one proof of work is really tricky to go pull off. You know, precisely because if you, I mean, maybe the way I should say it is, trying to go do this in a soft fork is tricky to go pull off, because to be a soft fork, if you allow, you know, if you have a significant amount of security provided by the new proof of work function, yet you're also, because it's soft fork, using old proof of work function, then you aren't really protecting old nodes. Because you would expect, you know, in the event of attack, well, attackers would either just use this new proof of work, or or, you know, if you're trying to go and move a significant amount of work to the new proof of work function, you may be in a scenario where, you know, from the point of view of an old node, they're still getting attacked. I mean, it's very complex to go pull this stuff off, and likely from a technical point of view, you just get a straight switch over. You know, interestingly, I mean, ASIC manufacturers, they don't necessarily all, you know, well, they don't necessarily produce ASICs that can only actually do one proof of work. You may even get some weird thing where, you know, you go work with some ASIC manufacturers to slightly tweak the proof of work in a way that one manufacturer can use and one manufacturer can't. You know, there's tons of weird options there. But honestly, first and foremost, none of this is going to happen unless something gets attacked. You know, I think most of the game theory here is really about making it very clear that if you try to do this attack, you're not going to win. So please don't try in the first place.
I do recall
nuclear deterrent.
I do recall some earlier altcoins that would change their proof of work style with every block, and the goal was to be ASIC resistant or ASIC proof, and they had kind of every imaginable algorithm, so it would be impossible. Is that the kind of, it sounds like a very political thing. Is that kind of like a nuclear bomb at the miners, like we'll make it impossible for you to use your ASICs?
Well, I mean, for Bitcoin miners, if you change anything, it'll probably be impossible for them to use their ASICs. You know, because ASICs, they get efficiency by being custom hardware. You know, after all, every single transistor you have on the hardware that does something other than SHA-256 hashing is something that you probably could have been doing SHA-256 hashing. You know, it's a little more complex than that, but that's kind of roughly how this stuff works. Any change you make is probably going to make all their hardware worthless. Now, again, though, I'd caution you, like, will miners actually go attack? My gut feeling on this is a bluff. Because, you know, even if you're in China, why would you want to actively attack another coin when they can probably go switch to proof of work anyway? You're probably going to go tank the value of the whole system by showing that coins can get attacked. You know, you can imagine the headlines on CNN, Bitcoin, you know, gets attacked by Chinese miners, from some reporter who didn't quite understand the full situation or didn't care to present it. You know, and equally, I would argue if you reported that, it would be correct. You know, you're getting an attack from miners. Plus,
I think it's also a good time. Sorry, go ahead. Sorry.
I'd just say plus. I mean, let's face it. Would you really want to be standing in front of a prosecutor in the U.S. saying, "Yeah, my pool went and attacked Bitcoin"? No, it's not actually an attack. It's, this complex thing isn't attacked somehow, but Bitcoin users couldn't do stuff. No, but it's not an attack. Like, you could go take that risk. I mean, Roger Ver is a convicted felon, so maybe he's willing to take that risk again, but I think there's a lot of people there who would hesitate at actually doing that.
For the record, if people haven't heard, Roger had a brief jail stint when he was very young for selling fireworks. I'm not sure the size of the fireworks. I think that's where we'd
keep in mind, it wasn't just selling, it was also storing them, in particular storing them in a residential apartment. I mean, I got nothing against people playing with explosives, but storing them in an apartment building, I don't think that's all that ethical.
It's a very libertarian
in the middle of the field.
He's clearly endangering fellow people, but if you're libertarian, you don't care about that. So yeah, that's a back and forth. But I was going to say, to impart a historical example and not to say anything negative about the Chinese people, just to quote this story, there was an ancient story where, well, not even ancient, but Mao Zedong had a problem. The sparrows were eating the crops. So what Mao said is he said to his people, stop what you're doing, put everything down, get 2 pots from the kitchen and go out in the field and bang the pots, and the sparrows will fly in the air and the sparrows will never be able to land because they're so freaked out because you're banging the pot. So everybody did this, and nobody watered the crops. Nobody took the weeds. Nobody took care of the crops. And I don't know the numbers, but more people died because of this sparrow situation than any other Stalin, Hitler, any other nightmare in history. People starved to death because of this sparrow problem. And I hope we don't repeat this. Bitcoin is a great thing. I think it's great. Roger said it's great. I'm sure, Peter, you think it's great, or at least interesting. It's an interesting project. And I'd hate to see it destroyed just to stop the sparrows, right?
Well, it's interesting. Like, in terms of an attack, that's a very apt analogy. You're actually pretty good at this. But in that, to do an attack on proof of work costs money. And how credible is your threat really if you're saying, all right, we're going to go keep attacking this coin. Exchanges on it are probably going to halt withdrawals. So there's no way for you to necessarily get recouped from your expenses attacking it. You're probably trying to go push the price down anyway. I mean, at what point do you go give up because it's costing you too much money? And when you give up, well, what happens when people start moving back and restarting it? If you really have true believers on the Bitcoin side, they may very well just pick up the paces after you give up after the first 2 weeks of your attack, because it is costing you a ton of money. And then
this of course links to the spam attacks. Are the blocks really full, or are the blocks full of spam? Is that what you're saying?
Well, I mean, yeah, that's actually another example of an attack which costs money. Although spam attacks are kind of interesting in that if you're a miner doing them, your cost to do the attack can be zero, right? In that you're paying the fees to yourself. Now there is a potential opportunity cost, and that maybe you could have mined real transactions. Equally, if some miners are mining blocks that are not under your control, there's a cost there. But it's not quite like proof of work in that sense. Now, having said that, I mean, it certainly is true that people are doing spam attacks on Bitcoin. I mean, there's just no reason to, as an example, take tens of millions of Bitcoins and send it over and over again to the same address from the same address. Like, there's no rational reason for people to be doing this.
Maybe it makes a little sound like it goes ding each time and somebody likes it.
Yeah. I can get you a cheaper ping machine. But, people are going to do this kind of thing. And I think a lot of the work that's actually being done in Bitcoin Core in the past few years has been making Bitcoin much more resilient to this kind of spam attack, in that we have fee estimation, we have much better ways to go deal with mempools. Wallets in general, all across the board, do fee estimation much better. We have transaction replacement, so you can go bump fees after the fact. And we have child pays for parent, so that if you receive a transaction, you can bump the fee of the transaction that was sent to you by respending it again. And, does this necessarily solve everything? Of course not. I mean, making Bitcoin actually scale would solve this stuff, but it's a very good mitigation. And you just have to accept the fact that people with deep pockets will do these kind of attacks. I mean, if it's Roger Ver doing it, who knows? But always remember, this could be, the big banks people are so apparently afraid of, trying to go do this too.
And those are solid. Those are solid improvements. The replace by fee, the child parent, as you're discussing there, those are solutions to this problem that have come up presumably from the core team. So I like to hear that. I
Well,
think that's great.
replaced by fee, actually, that's originally from Satoshi, and his version of transaction replacement used end sequence. And what replaced by fee did is it got rid of the DOS attack that was inherent to Satoshi's version by forcing you to just pay more money for every replacement. Simplest thing ever, but that's your kind of backstory, so I shouldn't take credit for it.
Unless you're Satoshi.
Well, I'm going to deny that, but I mean, Satoshi would deny that too, which is kind of suspicious.
Well, and I think this is another good point to discuss. Satoshi Nakamoto, essentially the creator of Bitcoin and essentially the leader of Bitcoin for the first few years. Gavin went and spoke to the CIA and some other people, and then Satoshi seemed to disappear. Not sure if those are related or just a correlation. But do we need a leader? Do we need a new Satoshi?
Well, leaders are a central point of failure. I mean, if you need a leader and the leader can enact real change, then that leader can also be bribed, coerced. I mean, there's a lot of bad things that can happen. I'd much rather people go and pick what software they run, based on their own facts, their own evidence, not because some leader tells them to. And I think like what happens in Bitcoin Core is people try very hard to avoid having leaders, to avoid kind of having a voice, precisely because we should have people evaluating things on technical merits. Does this always work now? I mean, let's face it, like humans are hardwired to want leaders. But in a decentralized system, we really need to avoid that.
And with the same idea of the leader, does Core need a press representative? Do they need a PR firm? Do they need to maybe, in the same way that they get together and they vote on software and they go through all of the steps of the software, do they need to hire a PR rep? Is that something that's missing in this discussion?
On the one hand, I'd say it's missing, but on the other hand, I'd say in the current political context of Bitcoin, that'd be very bad for them to do. Because we really need to get away from this idea that Core controls Bitcoin. And for a starter, the fact that we can't seem to get SegWit through should negate that. But you still have so many people who don't understand how this issue really works. They don't understand that this is ultimately software and you choose to run it. Bitcoin Core, they don't even have auto updates. And there's a very good reason for that. We don't want the ability to directly control the network. We can certainly persuade people. I mean, the fact that I'm on this show shows that some people are much better at persuading people than others. But that shouldn't, that should stay at that level. It shouldn't be we have an official setup and we can go push changes through political maneuvering. And equally on the miner side, the fact that you have such concentrations of power is, very harmful in many ways. I mean, who knows what's actually happening behind the scenes with the Chinese government? We know that many of the miners from that area are suspiciously against privacy. We, for instance, had 8BTC, site started by Jihan, has published quite a few articles, being very much against privacy, and for instance, even calling out SegWit for potentially enabling better privacy solutions. Where is that coming from? You could, if you wanted to be with conspiracy theorists, imagine people pressuring others to do this. And, again, that's the kind of thing you want to get away with. Equally, as a developer, do I want to be in a position where my local government thinks, all right, if I go knock on this guy's door, I will be able to very directly influence, the development of Bitcoin protocol? To a certain extent, they can already do that, but you want to mitigate that. You don't want to make this a very direct, all right, those are the guys you got to talk to. They can go push through changes. Currently in Ethereum, they kind of have that situation with Vitalik, and I don't necessarily think it's done Ethereum any good.
So with the current situation, why do you think things are kind of coming apart? For me, I'm worried that Core isn't communicating enough or they haven't hired a rep. I know there's a difficulty in doing that, but I fear that communication would be the failure. And I think it's not that it's an easy thing to do, but compared to the code and the tech, it's less strenuous. Are we going to fail because we're not talking?
Well, I mean, in some ways, I more than anyone else has seen the sort of the talking side of things, and what that can do. In that that Hong Kong agreement, I mean, I'm the guy who architected it. I'm the guy who sat down and figured, all right, this is the kind of technical things we could do. And in that famously long 18-hour meeting, we discussed in great detail what was being proposed, how we could go take that 4 megabytes and shift it around.
This idea of sitting everyone down in the same room, not letting them leave, this is what everyone says. So you did what everyone said.
Yeah, exactly. I went and did exactly that. And frankly, it kind of annoys me to have people in the mining community claiming things that in person they seem to be pretty clear on. I mean, a good example being this notion that I, as a Bitcoin Core contributor, could not represent the whole team. We were very clear on that in the meeting, and you would think that communication worked. I mean, they seem to agree with us in person, but then you kind of get people trying to go claim that, oh no, we thought we were negotiating with Core, we didn't go what we wanted, etc. And you seem pretty clear that this is a proposal, and it's only going to work if you take that proposal to the wider community and they agree with it. And of course, what happened was the exact opposite. So, could more communication help? I'm not really sure it would. And after all, based on what we're seeing, on some opposition to SegWit that's more recently getting revealed, I mean, it sounds like what we actually have is just a fundamental disagreement, both with what Bitcoin should be for, as well as a misalignment of incentives. Will more communication fix that? I mean, if your incentives are misaligned, I think both sides understand the situation, and they're trying to, see how far they can get and get Core to blink, if you will.
So now the two sides there would be, one, people want to use Bitcoin to buy coffee. They want many small transactions and very cheaply. Other people want to use Bitcoin to buy houses. They want slow moving transactions and they can store their value there. Is that a good simplification of the two sides?
Yeah, I think that actually simplifies it a little too much. The two sides I was kind of thinking of there are, the mining community and the developers and users. Because after all, I think we have a reasonable proposal with the likes of, Lightning and similar payment channel solutions to make both sides happy. And what you were saying with the high value and low value. Whereas from a miner's point of view, for a certain type of miner, particularly a very centralized one who has a lot of hashing power in one place, they may want a bigger role in Bitcoin in the future. They may want to be able to control every transaction. And that's just incompatible with, I think, what users are interested in there. Now, obviously, I think a lot of users are getting disenfranchised by the fact that as of right now, transaction fees are going up. For users who can afford them, Bitcoin still works as it does before. It's just getting a bit more expensive. But some use cases for Bitcoin are just getting completely priced out of the market. And that's just a reality that I wish we could go fix with better scaling tech. But if miners are holding up that tech, I mean, what can you do?
And let's go a little bit more into the conspiracy type stuff. I've heard that the Blockstream company is funded by banks and insurance companies. I also know that Blockstream does not equal Core. So explain some of that to me. I've met a couple of the Blockstream guys. I know Johnny and Eric. They're nice guys. They work hard. What's the deal with Blockstream?
Well, I mean, first and foremost, not that many people at Blockstream actually work on Bitcoin Core. And for instance, one of the people who did, Matt Corallo, he actually left Blockstream recently. I personally, back when Blockstream was getting founded, I was approached by them, and I said no because I thought it would be better to ensure that people, stayed out of one company. And what's happened since then is, exactly that. Not that many people actually work at Blockstream on Bitcoin Core. Greg guesstimates equivalent about 1.5 people full time. Peter Wool's full time, and then a bunch of other people contribute to varying degrees. But you got a much wider community on top of that. And you have, for example, in full time paid positions, you have MIT goes and supports Corey Fields and Vladimir. Also recently hired Taj from Lightning. You have Ledger Labs, who supports Matt Corallo, and Alex and Suhas, who they're some of the most prolific contributors. I mean, I myself am getting some funding from BTCC, and there's I think Jonas Schinelli, if I remember correctly, was getting funding from one of the Chinese exchanges as well, a different one than BTCC. You know, and many other contributors to putting less amounts of work. And oh, and come think of it, Jeremy Rubin as well, who recently did a bunch of work on better parallelizing validation. I believe he's also with chain code. So, you know, it's a pretty wide group there, and a lot of the key people are not involved in Blockstream at all. You know, really the one key person who, you know, is full time and really does this is Peter Wool. You know, and here maintainer who actually.
Sorry, so yeah,
say, like, you know, the maintainer is MIT.
All right, so the Bitcoin developers are much more distributed than most people think. Most people have a false impression, or perhaps I had a false impression. But my understanding is that Blockstream is mainly working on sidechains. What do you think about sidechains? My basic understanding is that we need the SegWit to get to the sidechains. Sidechains would be amazing. We could use Bitcoin's processing power for other projects, but then there's a whole dark side of that where they're worried about one company controlling the sidechains. What do you think about all that? Well,
first of all, the sidechain that Blockstream is putting most efforts in, their liquid sidechain, doesn't use SegWit at all. It's just a standard multisig with the federation, and you know, similarly, many of the kind of you know, less directly related Bitcoin applications, again, you know, none of this needs SegWit. As for the merge mine type of sidechain, you know, their famous paper on sidechains, again, that doesn't actually need SegWit, and since it needs miner support, I mean, if you can get them to work at all, obviously miners would be able to go and implement the changes necessary anyway. You know, so to think SegWit's kind of blocking that up kind of misses the point. You know, I personally had very strong criticisms of merge mine sidechains. I'd say they're equivalent to a block size increase. And from what I've seen, you know, I criticized Blockstream very heavily on that, and for the most part, they haven't really been working on the idea. You know, and again, it kind of goes to show, like, if one guy like me can troll them on Bitcoin Talk and they stop really working on something, to say they're really in control of the protocol is a little strange.
All the emperors seem to have no clothes. Let's see. We also had a question about Bitcoin Unlimited. I've heard it's going to have a president and a governing structure. Is this something that you support? Should we be adopting this for Bitcoin Core?
I think that's kind of crazy. You know, I'm amazed that they would even go do that from like a political point of view. You'd think if like they thought that was necessary, they'd at least do that behind the scenes.
It was a surprising unlibertarian
seems naive.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it just seems politically naive. I mean, like, let alone the fact it's a bad idea. Like, even just to put that out in the open at this point, it's just weird. I mean, I don't know. A lot of stuff about Bitcoin Unlimited, just, you kind of wonder, like, how much experience these people have with big projects, and, you know, how much they kind of understand the political side of this stuff.
It reminds me of a previous Bitcoin fork. I think it was Bitcoin Classic, where one of the devs said, well, what we want to do is we want to make it so you can vote on anything, even the 21 million Bitcoin limit. And that's one of the big economic things for me. I love that there's a fixed limit. That's huge for me. And it freaks me out when they say we could change that.
Yeah, and I mean, again, like, having this kind of stuff up for vote on a centralized website with, you know, no clear way of coming to consensus on, you know, who is actually supposed to be voting and how you can count the votes just strikes me as weird. You know, it seems politically naive to go do this. You know, and you go back even further to Bitcoin XT. Mike Kern made it very clear. Well, you know, I am dictator of Bitcoin XT, and that's that. Like, why would you say that? You know, you've got a whole community of people who love decentralization. Why wouldn't you at least hide that, you know, until you got your power? It's so strange.
Especially here in the US, where we don't have a democracy where it's just 51 to 49. We have a republic and a whole complicated system of checks and balances. And it's much more like you're talking consensus. I think the core was seeking 95% to activate SegWit. That's consensus. That's some agreement, right?
Well, and after all, like, the thinking behind that 95% is, in an ideal world, we get everyone to agree this is a good idea. And for, like, so 3 prior soft forks, before that. The fix to how exactly how signatures were, what signatures were valid. That's a security-related fix. That got your 95%. My own check lock time verify got 95% quite easily, and check sequence verify got that 95% quite easily. And had they not done that, maybe you want to step back and reconsider. But first and foremost, why not get everyone to agree? If you're going to get that, great. And if it makes things take a little longer, it's not really a big deal. Check lock time verify from start to finish, I'd have to check my dates on this, was probably like, 2 years worth of on and off work. And that's all right. It's not great, but, I made sure we had a really good process and everyone was quite happy about it. We got likes of Gavin and Jeff Garzik to think, yeah, this is actually worthwhile. We've done something solid there. Now, if you don't get that kind of consensus, well, then you can start discussing. But, in some ways, like, democracy is not your ideal situation. Your ideal situation is for people to be able to do their own thing without affecting others, and to not have to have a democracy in the first place.
A very libertarian statement there. Very libertarian.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. Me personally, most of my research efforts in Bitcoin have been trying to figure out ways to do interesting things without having to ask permission. Not from miners, not from anyone. My first big project on Bitcoin, open timestamps, it is specifically designed in a way that it will work regardless of what miners do. It's very censorship resistant. And that's because I don't want to be in a position where I'm asking someone else permission.
How is Bitcoin different than other open source projects you've worked on?
I haven't worked on any other open source projects anywhere to the same degree as I have on Bitcoin. So, take this kind of with a grain of salt in that, I just don't have too much experience working directly in that. But what I have seen for the few I have kind of dabbled in is, I think the nature of the projects makes them, when you compare to, say, Bitcoin Core, makes the political issues a lot less controversial, for the simple reason that usually with software, if I use a different package than you use, that's okay. We can disagree, we can do our own thing, and it's not a big deal. Whereas in Bitcoin, because this is a protocol that everyone in a multi-billion-dollar economy is using each other, you got to think much more about how the politics work, and you want to be much more careful about it. And the stakes are simply higher because there's more money involved. So, the dynamics I've seen in Bitcoin versus other projects I've been involved in are just so different, it's hard to even compare them.
And one more technical question, we're almost out. What about a replay attack? Is Bitcoin unlimited to replay attacks? If the exchanges adopt this new Bitcoin, will they lose all of their funds?
Yeah, proposals for replay taxes and don't handle them at all are definitely very dangerous. For exchanges, they have the technical know-how and ability to mitigate replay attacks. They'll probably still be subject to some of them because, after all, you don't know when Bitcoin Unlimited will actually go fork necessarily. And if that side of the community was being kind of evil, they'd take advantage of this and coordinate exactly what, when it forks, to, for instance, taking a bunch of money out of exchanges and trying to screw them over that way. But I think your real problem is people with light clients, because light clients just can't tell what chain they're on. Not all light clients are this insecure, but the true connect only to the peer-to-peer network ones, like Bitcoin Wallet for Android, or really anything kind of based directly on Bitcoin J. Those are really dangerous because I might think I am paying you one currency when I'm actually giving you another currency or both currencies at once. And you're going to quote your prices in one currency. And if I could give you two, I just lost a bunch of money. So unfortunately, for Bitcoin Unlimited to not fix replay is just really negligent to them. Particularly when all clients are going to have to upgrade anyway. Even these light clients, the fact of the matter is, currently they connect to peers on the network, not based on which blockchain they're following, right? Just based on the sort of total work, and the actual peer selection themselves is either based on the DNS seeds, which for itself is a bad idea, but that's a whole nother issue, or for better designed ones, just peers they already know, but there's no guarantee that they're going to actually connect to the chain they think they're connecting to. So they have to be upgraded. Well, since they have to be upgraded, why don't you go do the 2 or 3 more lines of code to also make sure that's replay's fixed? And it's very simple to do. You just modify Bitcoin Unlimited after the fork happens, make sure that signatures are hashed slightly differently. So that when you go sign a transaction, you're signing for one chain and not the other. This is not a hard technical thing. And unfortunately, I think the Unlimited team is doing this in part, as their strategy to try to ensure that only one chain can exist by, essentially telling exchanges and other users, we're going to make it difficult for you to know what you're doing. Same reason why I think there's all this talk about actively attacking Bitcoin. If you actively attack it, you're trying to kill the other chain.
So what should users do going forward? I've been advising people to hold your own private keys, either in, like you're saying, not a light wallet in the Bitcoin Core wallet, maybe a Trezor or a Ledger or a paper wallet. Coinbase said if you hold keys there, you're not going to get both sides of the fork. If you get both sides of the fork, you get coins on both chains, so you could just hold them, and then whichever way it goes, you'd be fine. What would you suggest, Peter?
I mean, it's kind of hard to say because wallets haven't, after all, we don't actually know exactly what Bitcoin Unlimited is yet. The fork hasn't happened, so it's hard to necessarily give good advice. It certainly gives you more options if you control the private keys yourself. And certainly from the point of view of only accepting coins that are on the chain you're expecting, running a full node using wallet like Bitcoin Core itself, certainly a good way to go do it. Similarly, and I don't know exactly what the plans are for different light wallets, but if one of them said, all right, we connect to a trusted node to tell us whether or not these blocks are on the chain that we expect them on, that's your ideal scenario. So you actually get what you're expecting. But when that fork actually happens, you're still going to need tools to split those coins. And as far as I know, none of them are coded up yet. No wallets have support already for this. It's not that hard to do. It'll probably happen relatively quickly, but it may be a few days before you can safely spend your coins again. And certainly keep watching the media and see what, follow Twitter, because within the first, within the first few seconds after an unlimited block is actually mined, people are going to start telling other people about it. So, make sure that if this happens, you're going to know about it.
All right, and one more question in closing. How do you see the next few weeks going? Will there be a Bitcoin fork? Will Bitcoin Unlimited, will Core win? Will there be 2 chains? What's your vision of the future?
Well, you only have to go look at the Bitfinex Bitcoin and Unlimited, token, where was the right term, kind of token split that they have to go and get a good idea of this. Because even though that's a bet really that Unlimited will be created prior to the end of this year, Unlimited is trading significantly lower valuation than Core, which is a good sign that the market doesn't think this split is actually likely to happen anytime soon. I'd give it, say, if you want to give me want to put a rough figure, that 50-50 odds in a year, Unlimited coin still won't exist. For all this kind of bluster, like, do people really want to go and pull the trigger on this? I suspect not. I suspect a lot of this is bluffing.
And if they do pull the trigger, you'll find out about it here, or by following MadBitcoins on Twitter, or maybe following Peter Todd, because we're going to talk about it just as soon as it does. So thanks so much, Peter, for being on the show. I hope we've cleared up a lot of misconceptions and talked more about the core technologies. Like I said yesterday, I'm working on a question sheet for a round 2 with Roger Ver. We'll see if we can schedule that tomorrow or in the next couple days. And then maybe after that, we'll do a round 2 with Peter, get your thoughts on that. And just generally, I wanted to make sure before this thing happens, because it seemed like with the 30%, with the exchanges getting ready, there was a lot of things like this was going to happen. And I said, well, let's at least try to talk about it before it happens. Maybe we can slow it down, get people discussing this again, and try to get the 2 sides to come together. So thanks so much, Peter, for joining us.
Thanks for having me on.
All right. And we're out of time. Until next time. Bye-bye.